Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ya Ali Madad. Are faith and science two distinct and separate entities, or are they interconnected in different ways, such that positioning them vis-a-vis one another becomes problematic? Do they serve entirely different and incompatible functions, or is there a common ground between them by which we could come up with a coherent way of understanding faith and science as two sources for knowledge, which are not necessarily in conflict with one another? What I will be trying to elaborate on is the latter, that faith and intellect, with science being a product of both, cannot be incompatible. Have you ever thought about the fact that as individuals, as we grow up, in many areas we gradually become less and less dependent on our parents? There are certain needs that all human beings have, whether emotional or social, for which our parents continue to be an important part of our lives for a very long time. Now, let's think of human beings as creatures of God. Where and when do we need God? A believer would immediately say, always and everywhere. On the level of faith, this seems like a reasonable answer, and it is in line with the foundations of the belief of any believer in God. But if we change the question to something different, if you need a cup of tea, do you ask God to give you a cup of tea? Almost every believer would at once reject the idea as ridiculous. But why? Why don't we ask God to do everything for us? Why don't we expect Him to do this? The answer to these questions is probably found in how we identify ourselves as human beings, and also in how principles of faith, in our case the Muslim faith, describe the relationship between human beings and God. God has made human beings capable of doing certain things. As we read in the Quran, سَبِّحِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى الَّذِي خَلَقَ فَسَوَّى وَالَّذِي قَدَّرَ فَهَدَى. Glorify the name of your Lord, the highest, who created and proportioned, who measured and guided. What would have been the point of this creation and proportioning if human beings were to rely entirely on God in every single matter? What would have been the point of this measurement, determination, and guidance if God would have to always intervene in everything? God, according to the faithful believers, has created us and has given us the tools for the needs that we have. And these tools have their purposes, and their purposes are embedded in them. As the Holy Quran says, أَلَمْ نَجْعَلْ لَهُ عَيْنَيْنِ وَلِسَانًا وَشَفَتَيْنِ وَهَدَيْنَاهُ النَّجْدَيْنِ. Did we not give him 2 eyes, a tongue and 2 lips, and guided him to the 2 highways? Now, among the noblest of all gifts given to human beings is a brain, the intellect, the capacity to think. What do we use this brain for? What do we use the intellect for? Does it have any limits? In the very first chapter of the sermons of the Fatimid Ismaili Da'i al-Mayyad Fadina Shirazi, he proposes a fundamental statement which is integral to Ismaili intellectual heritage. His claim has grave consequences. This is the statement. Shariat is based on reason. As he goes on to prepare the premises for his argument, he refers to people who think that the Sharias of the prophets are not based on intellect, but require a different category from reason in order to understand and submit to them. The Ismaili Dai openly calls these people those who blindly follow their predecessors and submit to something without knowledge. In simple terms, the group he criticizes are basically saying that matters of faith are above and beyond human reason, and one cannot use the human mind to question these religious laws and must just leave them to the wisdom of the divine authorities. But let's look at one of his arguments, which is based on a hadith. Now, this is the tradition in question. The first thing that God created was the intellect. Then he said to it, come forward, and it did. Then he said to it, go backward, and it did. Then he said to it, by my honor and my glory, I have not created a creature more glorious than you. By you shall I reward, and by you shall I punish. His next line of argument is that human beings will eventually be judged based on the capacity of their own human mind, their own human reason. And he offers this tradition to support his argument and to anchor it within the context of faith. And as such, he argues that every commandment or prohibition in religion must be based on reason. Otherwise, it would defy this tradition and also make human reason redundant and obsolete. His point of reference is this part of it. It is through you, the intellect, that I will reward and punish. In other words, all ethical responsibility relies on having this human capacity to think, to question, and to choose. Why would God give human beings a brain and the capacity of reasoning and then prohibit them from using it? Of course, some who have disagreed with this position have said over centuries that human reason has limits and cannot grasp everything. Therefore, it requires divine assistance. Here is, of course, a contentious area. Who determines what is the limit of human reason? How do we know this? This itself becomes a question of authority, of course. We do not have the time in this short talk to undertake an overview of various responses to this question, but we can have a brief overview of the positions of some Ismaili dais, one of which we just talked about. Dai Nasir Khusro, in his famous autobiographical Qasida, has also addressed this issue. They said that injunctions of the Shariat do not conform with reason. Guftan ki mawzu' Shariat never aql ast, because Islam was established by the mere force of the sword. This I answered with a question. Why then are prayers not prescribed to the children and weak-minded, if reason was not required for the discharge of religious duties? I could never accept the blind following of prescribed forms without any demand for explanations. The truth cannot be proven by blind acceptance. But when I asked my teachers about the reasons for various injunctions of the religious laws or solid rational arguments on which they are based, none proved to be helpful. One resembling the blind and the other the deaf. The discussion about the rational foundations for religious laws is long, but I would like to move from this premise to another very important discussion. If human reason is so noble and so respectable, and if there is no contradiction between faith and reason, then how do we deal with apparent conflicts between the findings of science and what some believers over the centuries have considered to be factual, despite clear refutations found for them in science? Do the faithful have a claim to truth, all truth, universally? And when there is a conflict, one must relinquish science in favor of the opinions of the faithful, often represented as the very core and essence of faith. But is this binary or dichotomy even a valid and reasonable one? Looking back into history may teach us some lessons. In the famous trial of Galileo, the Catholic Church put the scientist on trial because his scientific findings had challenged what the Church believed to be the tenets of the Christian faith. The most famous finding of Galileo was that the Earth is not the center of the solar system, which was the Ptolemaic system, the Ptolemaic cosmology of the time. Where was the root of this conflict? The straightforward answer was that the custodians of Christian faith were representing their human understanding of Christianity as utter, absolute, and infallible truth, and represented their human understanding of the divine as the divine itself. We know the rest of the story. It is history now. Science triumphed in the end, and the custodians of faith, human beings hiding behind the shield of divine authority, eventually and unwillingly retreated. But what about Muslims? Did we have the same situation among Muslims? There have surely been cases in history, as there are cases today, in which certain Muslims projected their own understanding of scriptures or traditions to be infallible and representative of pure truth. And when there is a conflict, they tend to resort to faith. This conflict, this dichotomy, is a false one. Science is the product of the activity of human reason, of human intellect, which is a gift of God given to human beings to be employed for precisely these purposes. In the same way that we do not ask God to give us a cup of tea, we do not wait for God to give us a solution to the problem of deforestation, air pollution, transport, space travel, or pandemics. Trusting the assistance of God is one thing, but leaving human intellect redundant and obsolete, and worse still, suppressing it in the name of faith, is in sharp contrast with a Muslim understanding of reason. Let's look at a specific contentious example. What is the age of the earth? Is it 6,000 years, or is it a figure in the order of billions of years? Those who believe in the former base their claim on what biblical scriptures literally tell them. They are known as creationists. Those who reject the former and support the latter are the people who accept the theory of evolution. Do Muslims accept the theory of evolution? There is an interview in the New Scientist magazine with Salman Hamid, a professor of science and humanities, on this issue. His key point is that the Quran does not provide a single clear-cut verse that contradicts evolution. And he proceeds to explain how in many Muslim countries evolution is taught at schools and it does not receive the same harsh reaction it receives in some parts of the Western world. But is faith itself categorically equivalent to blind submission or accepting something out of ignorance? Human history and the history of science give us a different picture. Even in science, which is known to be rational and empirical, there are foundations and principles which cannot be proven. They're not as such testable. These are called axioms or postulates. Without these postulates, it is impossible to proceed in science. It is clear then that a degree of faith or trusting some foundational axioms is critical in order to expand our knowledge of something, whether it is scientific inquiry or knowledge in matters of faith. But here a word of caution, a word of warning is necessary. The fact that in science we have some postulates which are not rationally proven does not mean that in matters of faith we should broadly and categorically apply this and suppress the use of the intellect. We need to be cautious about excessive and unwarranted use of this argument when it comes to the context of religion. In his memoirs, Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah mentions a point about the origins of man's religious aspirations. The origins of man's religious aspirations are to be found in what we nowadays call science. Those who have studied mythology and primitive psychology know that magic in various forms started various trains of thought in primitive man by which he achieved what seemed to him to be rational accounts of the natural phenomena he saw around him. It seemed to him rational that these phenomena, these events like the rising and the setting of the sun, the passage of the seasons, the flowering of the bud and the ripening of the fruit, the wind and the rain were caused and controlled by deities or superior beings. Primitive religious experience and primitive scientific reasoning were linked together in magic, in wizardry. Thus, at one and the same time, mankind's experiences in the realm of sensation and his strivings to explain and coordinate those experiences in terms of his mind led to the birth of both science and religion. The two remained linked throughout prehistorical and ancient times and in the life of the early empires of which we have knowledge. It was difficult to separate what I may call proto-religion from proto-science. They made their journey like two streams, sometimes mingling, sometimes separating, but running side by side. We are now in the 21st century, and certainly no longer in the primitive stages of understanding science or religion. But it is important to acknowledge this trajectory in order to better situate ourselves in our times. It is a true statement that there are different levels of intellectual capacity. Some are more competent in using their intellect, this noblest of all divine gifts. Those who are less competent in an area of using these skills would normally use the expertise of those who are more qualified in various disciplines and fields. If you're sick, you go to a physician who is trained to treat illnesses. You do not leave it to miracles or divine intervention. Examples are numerous. Are there areas which require a different kind of expertise? Faith tells us about the hereafter. We have also often heard from faith leaders and our imams that guidance on the path of truth and salvation in the hereafter is the area for which they are responsible. Does science make any claim on these areas? We know from philosophy of science, at least in modern times, that a scientist would generally remain silent about a subject that he or she cannot subject to tests, to falsification and refutation. If science cannot put to test a truth claim, then scientists usually do not enter a debate either positively or negatively. A scientist who argues that God exists, or conversely, that God doesn't exist, has not made a scientific statement. It is an axiom of belief, not a scientific statement. This is where we distinguish between science and faith. In order to explain all this in very simple terms, perhaps the best demonstration is the response of Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah to the bubonic plague of 1897. People were afraid to get the vaccination needed to stop the spread of the disease. Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah writes in his memoirs, "I had to act swiftly and drastically. The impact of the plague among my own people was alarming. It was in my power to set an example. I had myself publicly inoculated, and I took care to see that the news of what I had done was spread as far as possible and as quickly as possible. My followers could see for themselves that I, their Imam, had in full view of many witnesses submitted myself to this mysterious and dreaded process. Hence, there was no danger in following my example. The immunity of which my continued health and my activities are obvious evidence impressed itself on their consciousness and conquered their fear. I was 20 years old. I ranged myself against orthodox medical opinion of the time among Europeans no less than among Asiatics. And if the doctors were opposed to the idea of inoculation, what of the views of ordinary people in my own household and entourage, in the public at large? Ordinary people were extremely frightened. Among my own followers, the news circulated swiftly as I had intended it to do, that their Imam had been inoculated and that they were to follow my example. Deliberately, I put my leadership to the test. It survived and vindicated itself in a new and perhaps dramatic fashion. My followers allowed themselves to be inoculated, not in a few isolated instances, but as a group. Within a short time, the statistics were firmly on my side. The death rate from plague was demonstrably far, far lower among Ismailis than in any other section of the community. The number of new cases caused by contamination was sharply reduced, and finally, the incidence of recovery was far higher. Some of these people were rejecting the new solution to the problem on grounds of faith, thinking that God will eventually solve the problem for them. Others rejected it because of their traditional methods in medicine. And this was not something exclusive to Oriental people. Even Europeans at that time had the same beliefs. Some were doing it based on their social customs and habits in their societies, which were neither medical practice nor faith-related. Now, the question of the interaction between faith and intellect as two sources of knowledge has been at the heart of major theological and philosophical currents in the Muslim world. The Ismaili tradition, through history, as demonstrated in our primary sources, does not find a conflict between the two. Yet, the task of one is not expected from the other. There is a clear demarcation between the two so that neither faith nor intellect, with science being one of its most prominent expressions, are made redundant and obsolete. Any effort to replace or marginalize one in favor of the other is seen as ethically problematic. Both are given their due weight and significance in the face of material or spiritual challenges faced by humankind. At the same time, they can reinforce one another if correctly and reasonably interpreted. Indeed, Imam Ali tells us that one of the main functions of the prophets was to refresh and provoke the intellectual faculty of human beings. فبعث فيهم رسله وواتر إليهم أنبياءه ليستعدوهم ميثاق فطرته ويذكروهم منسي نعمته ويحتج عليهم بالتبليغ ويثير لهم دفائن العقول. Then Allah sent His messengers and dispatched His prophets towards them to get them fulfill the covenant in their natural dispositions, in fitra, to remind them of His gifts to them, to argue with them by spreading the word of wisdom, and to unveil, to uncover before them the hidden treasures of their intellects. We also have a similar theme expressed by Maulana Hazar Imam in an interview, which you're going to see shortly.
I don't see any conflict in the way I interpret Islam between the intellect and faith. And insofar as people's knowledge today is significantly different from what it was 1300 years ago, we have to live in our time. And indeed, I would vigorously oppose anybody who would claim that the faith of Islam cannot be of the 20th or 21st or 23rd, 25th century.
Let us continue to maintain a reasonable balance between the way we practice our faith and the way we attend to our intellectual duties as rational human beings living in our own times within an ethical framework. Ya Ali Madad.